what's really intriguing to me is that data became one of the top 3 factors for guiding a business's direction.
Right.
Which I wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago.
When did that happen? When would you say that was sort of the tipping point for people to realize data is important to me?
So I think people knew the value of data. The question is, can you think of the data as an instrument of the entire business? That's the distinction.
So we've had a great conversation so far about business transformation, sort of at a high level, but I'm really eager to get into a conversation about the details. I would say the devil's in the data, but let's talk about data and kind of the lifeblood or the new oil in AI. So it's easy to see how a company that's in the business of data, an AI company can get value out of their data, less so for a company that's not in that business. So I want you guys to talk a little bit about, the historical value of data, where it sits now with generative AI, and what makes it valuable. So, yeah.
I've looked at this most closely, of course, over the last few years in the healthcare sector.
Right.
And people sometimes are surprised to learn at the turn of the century, in the year 2000, only about 10% of health records were digital. If you're old enough, you probably remember going to your doctor's office and seeing a storeroom with
files
just
and,
files
like
and files
Indiana
and files.
Jones.
Right. And so from there to today, well over 99% of all clinical records today are digital. And if you think about the fact that this is almost 1/5 of the U.S. economy, it has just gone digital. It's not just those clinical records, but it's admission, discharge, transfer records. It's ERP. It is all of the instrumentation at the bedside in a hospital, all digital, all generating data all the time. And then increasingly, of course, even consumer health. How many people are wearing a Fitbit or an Apple Watch today, measuring their blood pressure, pulse, continuous glucose monitors are exploding, and so on. And so there has been this huge digitization in nearly every single industry that you can imagine. And what has been the challenge, and what is the big question for almost every CEO that I encounter is, how do we extract the value out of that data?
Yeah.
They are all hearing data is the new oil, so to speak, but it's still been a mystery, and it's been difficult to actually extract that value. I mean, Vijay, you have numerous discussions like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sort of people are very excited about 2 things that I've seen different with Gen AI. One is, as you said, people got digitized. So every transaction, every interaction has been captured to the extent privacy allows. And their point is, I can finally interpret this information. All these long PDFs, those reports, those email threads, issues that people raise, I actually can get value out of it. But the other change I've seen is a little bit more dramatic than that, which is, I'm in the business now of getting value from LLMs. These giant models are coming with a huge amount of world knowledge or world data already inside them. And now what I need to do them is to feed them in 2 main ways, and there's a third way also. One is, as Peter referred to in the previous discussion, RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation. So here are my company's standard operating procedures, our manuals, our instructions, our experiment reports. Retrieve the right ones and give it to the LLM as in-context learning. So that's one part. The second one is crafting careful examples, which is like how I solve a problem. So if I'm in the business of, let's say, a supply chain, how do I deal with a shortage? Do I go in the spot market, which will raise everyone's prices? Do I let anyone know? Who do I alert? Then you craft those examples. And traditionally, we have not really tried to collate those careful examples that represent our expertise, our methodology, our way of doing business.
If you think, let's say before the internet, when people started to realize that connecting computers together might create real value, and this whole idea of network effects. Network effects was the new oil in that time. It really kind of created a lot of excitement and at the same time a lot of confusion because just the simple fact of connecting computers together in a network wasn't in itself enough. There really had to be the whole infrastructure of the internet for true value to get realized and whole new categories of products and ways of realizing those effects. And so today, now there's a new type of gold rush here. Today, we're starting to see that there could be real value in data, and that somehow AI is going to be that new technology. It's not a network cable now. It's something called a large language model that is not only going to allow us as individuals or individual enterprises to realize more value from the data that we have, but also at scale, maybe bring whole industries, bring whole partnerships together to create, in a way, a network effect of data. Yeah. And so there needs to be both a boldness to understand where the world is going, to really position yourself and be ready and capable, competent to realize that value, but also patience and strategic patience, because it's something that for the full value to be realized, for the whole world to come together.
So one company that I spend time with, so this is the value of not just your own data, but data you can bring in or generate. Right. So this company has, it's now one of the 20 largest companies by market cap. They've grown tremendously. And they have a very simple formula that the board has imposed on major new products or radical new products. So they have 3 factors, and out of which 2 must be satisfied. One is that my existing technical know-how, my industrial skill must carry forward. That's obvious. Second is my distribution channel and my relationships must carry forward. And the third is my data must carry forward. Now that's very interesting. Data is a proxy for AI. Yeah. And my data is not just my data, but what I can get. So getting into a little bit into nuts and bolts here, what it now requires people to do is to sort of not only understand what data I have, but what data am I missing?
Right.
And if I'm going to somebody else for data, let's say there are 2 sources of data, which is more valuable for what I want to do? Yeah. So now you're getting into the art of quantifying, which is, Gretchen, you were mentioning earlier, quantifying the value of data. And then, of course, you don't have to just buy data or augment or license data. You can gather data, you can generate data. So we can cover those things later. Yeah. So there are more variables, but what's really intriguing to me is that data became one of the top 3 factors for guiding a business's direction. Right. Which I wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago.
When did that happen? When would you say that was sort of the tipping point for people to realize data is important to me?
So I think people knew the value of data. The question is, can you think of the data as an instrument of the entire business? That's the distinction.
I think the idea that data could be valuable has really driven a tremendous amount of investment by enterprises around the world to store, to acquire, and to aggregate data. But I think at the same time, honestly, there's been broad disappointment that those investments, it's been hard to get those investments to pay off.
Right.
And for example, in healthcare, every major healthcare organization that we work with here at Microsoft, every single one has invested millions of dollars in aggregation and collection of data, with the idea that better patient care, new medical knowledge can be extracted from these things, and efficiencies and cost reductions can be realized. But it's been incredibly challenging. And so I think the thing that has changed is that the rise of generative AI has given new hope. There's now a renewed optimism that at long last we can get those investments to pay off.
Yeah. You know, I have this analogy of hoarders. You know, you talk about the massive amounts of data that healthcare has, and how do you use data to benefit your business, to transform your business? And I guess that's the question that people are asking: is how do I move from being a data hoarder to being a wise user of data?
So maybe this is a good chance to get into some specifics here about questions that we get asked all the time. And so one thing, Gretchen and Vijay, that I've been asked by more than one CEO is a question along the lines of, I hear from my IT folks this term data architecture, but I don't really know what they're talking about. What is that?
I'll take a very narrow view to begin with, which is I have these large language models, which are gradually becoming large multimodal models. Some people are calling them large learning models. They're coming in. And throughout my company, it's not just my data scientists, but a whole bunch of other people are now exploiting this capability. And all of those people now need to be able to use my data. So the first one, of course, is make sure your data is available to people with the right access rights. But now we need to know more than that. We need to know the provenance. Which model was created with which data set? Okay, we have that covered. But now comes another Wild West. Everybody's creating prompts. And in the prompts, they're embedding data, either as few shots or by retrieving. No one is tracking that. And now what people are beginning to sort of say, hold it, I've taken the first major steps on generative AI, and now I need to get deliberate about it. So the architecture, just one part of the architecture, if you can track what is happening to data, who can use it, who is using it, and what is the outcome, you now have a basis for evaluating your data. I mean, there's more to it, but let's just stay with that.
Yeah, I think you're really touching on some key things, because the question about data architecture is really a question about what data do you keep, in what form, and how do you track the kind of provenance or chain of custody, how do you control access. And over the last decade or two, there's been tremendous effort by many companies, including Microsoft, to help companies define a sound data architecture and then shift their existing data sets to that architecture. And it's been enormous effort, some very good work by companies around the world. But it's also been frustrating. The joke is you define this beautiful data architecture, you manage to actually migrate an existing data set to that architecture, and you have it for a week. And then the normal rough and tumble and rapid agility of any modern enterprise just starts to stray away from that architecture. One of the things that's implicit in what Vijay was talking about is that one hope that the world has for generative AI, and we aren't quite there yet with today's AI, but we expect to get there with the next few generations of models, is that we will care a lot less about the precision of that architecture. That AI will have its own ability to understand the data estate and not be bound by a strict organizational structure.
Well, before you go on, and data estate is a huge term these days, I want to go up a little bit further on the architecture. When I think of it, and I'm not you guys, I think of a structure of a building, right? Is you got the foundation, you have the walls, you have the roof, and then all the stuff. And so for the people that are in the audience that don't really understand data architecture, could you get even a little more granular about what that looks like?
Yeah, I actually have an even sillier analogy, which is, you open your kitchen drawer and you probably have a nice little set of cubbies so you can put your cutlery in the right bins, your knives, forks, spoons, and so on.
It's not a junk drawer.
It's not a junk drawer. And of course, that's very useful because if you want a fork, you know right where to go. There's an architecture there, and a data architecture very, very vaguely is trying to accomplish the same thing. But it is, in any modern enterprise, incredibly challenging to achieve that level of organization for any defined architecture, and even harder to keep it maintained.
Yeah.
And so what if you had a magic technology, an AI robot that didn't care? You could just throw the cutlery in a
it would
elusive
sort it
drawer,
for you?
and it would, if you
No,
need
it'd
that
find
fork,
you.
it would find that fork for you. If you need to know how many forks you have relative to the number of spoons, it would be able to just look at it and just do that calculation for you. That ultimately is the ultimate dream of AI. And even in our newest products like Microsoft Fabric, the vision for Fabric is that as the AI improves, it will get closer and closer to that future where architecture matters less and less.
Right. There's been significant research in technologies that are helping businesses use their data estates. Maybe you guys can talk about what that means a little bit. But that's what they're saying is going to help unlock the full potential to transform, not just iterate on a business, but to change it fundamentally. So talk about what the data estate is and how you can tap into that besides a fork drawer.
Okay, so number one, you need to inventory. I like your estate sort of metaphor. You have to know what you have there. So I have all this data from patients, from customers, or from machines I've manufactured. Do I have lots of one type, but not enough of another type? Do I have enough contrast in them? Are they very biased towards certain types of demand and not another type of demand? So we need to firstly understand what we have. We need to then, often these, there's terminology called core set. Core data set is what is the smallest data sets that's representative of roughly what I have. The next part is, what do I want to achieve with this data? I want to tell an LLM to be able to solve an exception or a safety issue. Okay. Do I have enough data to actually achieve that task? So now these techniques are often called support sets, which is, do I have enough data to support the classification or the prediction, or the stuff like that? Now, so far we've talked about I need more data. But if I have too much data, like I've now got huge computation expenses, right, in training and in managing, as Peter said. If I have surfeit of data, I have duplicated data, it can go all over the place. So now we need techniques like data distillation around it. So that actually gives us a sense of what we have and what's really the nuggets in the day. But it's not just what you have, but what you're lacking. Right. That's really important part. So an estate is also the potential of the estate. And now we need other techniques, which is to evaluate the data. And data scientists do this every day. They do it for every time they build a model, they do it. But now we've got to systematize it. So if one data science team has looked at this data and said, we don't have enough of certain types of patients, certain types of conditions, certain types of safety issues, now we have to flag that. So other people are not repeating the same thing. And we also need to use that same lens when we are acquiring data. Mm-hmm. And the last one, of course, is create a blueprint for gathering the data. And now you can generate data. So the beautiful thing is that there are many types of data, and there are caveats. If you just generate data, ad hominem, you can get in trouble. But certain kinds of data, for example, you don't, hopefully in a chemical plant, you don't have too many safety issues. Mm-hmm. That means you don't have much data around safety issues. But you can generate data, like what to do, how to evacuate visitors, how to notify people, because LLMs have that background knowledge. So we can generate data. And of course, I'm hoping Peter will talk about hardcore generation techniques as well, right, where you're synthesizing data as opposed to just...
I think data estate, when I'm asked that question, it is simply, as Vijay explained, an inventory of the data investments that you've made, as well as an analysis of gaps in that. And
well, let me slide in there too with the generative pre-trained models. You've already got something that you didn't generate or train. You've got this thing, and then you're adding your own data and yet the synthesis.
right, and so now the question, the next question is, how can we harness generative AI? And the very first thing that I've been recommending here is to consider the use of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And retrieval augmented generation is actually a special case of a broader concept of giving an LLM, a generative AI system, the permission to use some of the tools that you've built. So if you have, let's say, created a database of clinical records and some tooling for retrieving data out of that database, then retrieval augmented generation is really nothing more than giving an LLM permission to use those database retrieval tools. And how is that done? It really is, in the magic of AI today, it is really not much more than giving the user manual for those tools to the LLM and asking it to read that user manual, and then giving it a task to interact with you and convert conversations into the right use of that tool. And so, in a way, the mindset that a CEO can have is around RAG is, what value would there be for your enterprise if you could give more of your employees their own personal data assistant? Maybe you have employees that are impeded or held back because they don't have access to a data scientist that knows how to write complicated database queries or use those data tools. What if you could give them access to an AI that could do that? That's the promise of RAG. And RAG is something that the world, including Microsoft, is still learning how to harness fully, but it is really a good step one.
Can I just add?
Yeah, please.
I think the way you explained is very profound, because I hadn't heard that part before, which is connecting RAG also to permission.
Yeah.
Because we've always had this tension: who deserves this data? And now, who needs this data? Need to know, right to know, and so on. And what you're now saying is, AI can actually decide those permissions.
Yes.
At the point of the task.
Yes.
As opposed to just do everything. And which goes back to your point of architecture, that AI can determine many, many layers in the architecture, and authorization is one part of the architecture.
Yeah, incidentally, RAG isn't just for existing data estate. So for example, in Microsoft Research, we have a RAG-based system internally. It's called the Microsoft Research Copilot, that actually has a huge amount of documentation, transcripts of lectures, copies of research papers, internal PowerPoint presentations and review documents, and so on. And it's all in Microsoft Fabric. And then there's a chat interface. And so now if, let's say, I hear my boss, our CTO, Kevin Scott, talk about some project, and I maybe embarrassingly am unaware of it, I can ask the Copilot, who's working on that project, and can you get me some of the internal documents and get me up to speed on this, summarize what it's about for me. Importantly for Microsoft Research, as we engage with our stakeholders across Microsoft, if one of our product team or business group partners maybe hears Satya Nadella talk about these great new small language models called Phi, and they want to learn more about it, or they might get a question from one of their customers and they want to be able to talk smartly about it, they can turn to the Microsoft Copilot and ask. So it's another RAG-based system. One other thing that's worth looking at, there's a very small RAG-based system, which is a custom GPT. So if you use OpenAI's ChatGPT, you can click on the Explore GPTs link, and search for Talk to Peter Lee about AI in healthcare.
That was the amazing experience talking to you without you being there.
Right.
Yes.
And so
Virtual
these are all RAG-based systems. And so RAG seems like a simple idea, just giving permission to use some tools, retrieval tools to an LLM, but it has a lot of surprising applications. And it is sort of the simplest first step here. But we can go further than that.
Vijay, I want to come back to you talking about the role generative AI can play in discovering new business opportunities through data. But before that, I want to ask you, Peter, because as you're talking, I'm thinking of a data Everest. You know, it's just this mountain of data, and thinking, I'm a CEO, I don't know data, I don't know, I'm not as technical as some of my people are. How much of a Sherpa do I need to get to the place where I would know how to, or do I mean, is it my data people? Are we democratizing data science? Are we making little data scientists all over the place? And how much does your company that makes the AI play a role in that?
You know, I have a bad joke about questions like that, which is when someone figures out the answer to that question, please tell me. But here's the way that I tend to think about this. Because in the same way that when we transitioned to the internet, we started to realize network effects, there are going to be dramatically amplified data effects that are coming. And so one way to frame up a thought process here is, if you think about the business that you're in, your partners, your customers, stakeholders, maybe even your competitors, try to understand what are the commonalities in both data assets and data estate and gaps. Because what is likely to happen at some point is that in the same way that the networking world passed a tipping point where every network company was jealously promoting their own proprietary network protocol,
right.
And finally, when they passed the tipping point and everyone adopted the internet protocol, that created success for everybody and really created this amplifying effect of the internet. We may also approach a tipping point where the kind of jealous guarding of proprietary data sets, the value of that might be superseded by the value of realizing and participating in a broader, say, industry-wide pooling and sharing of data.
Right.
And so you want to think hard about focusing on and being prepared to participate in those opportunities to the fullest extent possible, when and if that day comes.
Right.
A corollary of that is, because of generative AI, we do see in several industries that companies are actually motivated, at least for the time being, to be more selfish and more guarded and proprietary about their data, as opposed to less.
Right.
In the same way that echoes how networking companies behaved prior to the internet. And so, you know, it can be confusing, but it's important to keep your eye on the ball, especially if you're a CEO or a CTO, on the long term here. And the long term might only be 3 or 5 years from now.
Right. Well, and segueing from that, Vijay, if I'm a CEO or a CXO and I want to ride that wave, my metaphors are mixed all over the place. I apologize, from data estates and Downton Abbey to Everest to waves. What role am I going to see AI play, generative AI, in unlocking things I can't see yet? It's like the things that Peter's alluding to. How do I get positioned to do that?
So I'm going to take 2 examples.
Good.
One is, you might think it's internally focused, but it changes the way your company behaves, that people are looking at. And second, of course, is new product types.
Right.
So let's look at the first one. So increasingly, processes are getting automated. Customer service, customer support, but you still have what's called exceptions. An exception doesn't have to be an exceptional situation. It just happens to be an exception, like we haven't catered for it. And most of the cost of a company really goes in resolving the exceptions. And most of the time, of course, goes there. So now the question is, why do these exceptions happen? That means my systems are lacking some data. One big data that most business process systems are lacking today is multimodality. I mean, we have created a beautiful walled garden in business systems where an order comes in or procurement comes in or even a construction, I put that girder here, and that's it. Everything else is digital. Maybe you have a PDF attachment. Occasionally you have a photo that only an auditor will see. Therefore, you're lacking all the context that's actually around it, where there's email, which is a kind of modality in this way, or the noise that's happening and so on. So getting companies moving from yesterday's thinking of business processes to what actually happens in the world, that is a huge opportunity that everyone, I mean, we are not the first people to think about it, but certainly we are guiding people towards it. And if you do that, really, I mean, a huge amount of velocity changes.
I think we'll probably get into multimodality deeper in the next video, but I think there are even intermediate steps. We talked about RAG as sort of step one, and multimodality might be step 4 or 5. I think step 2 that I think is very interesting, and we do extensively within Microsoft, but several of our customers do too, is the use of generative AI to take large amounts of data and restructure it into a normalized form, and to do so intelligently, and not only normalize it, but then in response to a query, extract and label subsets of that data in preparation for machine learning of specialized models. We have witnessed the Providence Health System do this to take clinical records from all 51 of their hospitals. I mean, there's just all different formats and so on. But a GPT-4 class model, in fact, GPT-4 specifically, is able to look through all the data, restructure it into a common format, and then in response to a query like, which of these patient records are most likely candidates for a specific clinical trial, it's able to extract subsets of the data that will help train a model to solve problems like that. And then, we talked about small language models. I've always been uncomfortable with the term small there.
They're not that small at all.
And look, there is value in small. For example, our 5.3 models, the fact that they power features like recall in the latest versions of Windows and so on, and that can operate totally privately on your own personal edge laptop device. That's great. I prefer to use S standing for smart than small because these models have been explicitly designed with fine-tuning in mind. Really a raw-based model that's designed then to be retrained, to be specialized to a data set that you have.
I was just going to say specialized could be another S.
S, specialized, smart, small. And in fact, today, for the 5 models, we now have Azure services designed to fine-tune 5.3 models on your data. And so when you think about these stages, I look at these as a roadmap. It's I think you've called this, Vijay, an adoption roadmap. And there's just tremendous value in just thinking methodically about going down that roadmap.
Can I bring up an elephant in the room? Is data privacy, and we're talking about data, big data, all data, synthesized data, all of that. How am I going to think about that in terms of my promise to my customers that it's protected, both from your perspective and my company's perspective?
Yeah, so first off, the most fundamental thing is that if you are an enterprise customer and you have an Azure subscription, then everything that goes on in your Azure subscription is private and under the complete control of your enterprise. And specifically, any prompts, any model improvements, any responses never leak back or never used to improve the models, never go back to Microsoft or to OpenAI. But there is a more subtle challenge there because enterprises themselves are complicated places. And so, my co-pilot here within Microsoft is only allowed to see things that I, Peter Lee, am allowed to see within
And that's
within
way
Microsoft.
more than I'm allowed to see.
Or it's at least different.
What else?
And sometimes it's important to be able to manage that. And so another feature of the emerging services to support generative AI in the enterprise, things like Microsoft Fabric, have these sorts of data access provisions built in as part of that service. I think where things really get challenging are when you want to cross those boundaries. And this gets to be a very interesting place. Let me give just one example from the pure research side and then hand it to Vijay to bring it back down to earth.
Yeah.
One example that we've tested extensively with GPT-4 is its understanding of privacy laws such as HIPAA for protecting the privacy of health information. And so a typical experiment would be to have a database of patient data. And then we present this to GPT-4 and then give a prompt that basically says, GPT-4, we're going to ask you some questions that require slicing and dicing and analyzing this data, but under no circumstance reveal the personal protected health information of any individual, and please, abide by HIPAA. And GPT-4 will actually say that it understands HIPAA, and you can quiz it, and it seems to have a solid understanding of HIPAA. But it can be tripped up in that process, and occasionally will accidentally reveal, say, someone's weight or age. But the day is coming with future models where the understanding of privacy is going to be reliably protected by the intelligence itself. It's not quite there yet, but within an enterprise setting, this can be very important because while my co-pilot might have access to documents that Vijay's co-pilot doesn't, there may be special circumstances where I want to tell this co-pilot, it's okay in this one circumstance to share something with Vijay or his co-pilot, and for our co-pilots to be intelligent enough to manage that. We're not quite there yet, but at the minimum, the privacy and the protection of access to data is pretty solid now today.
Well, and just to say that, you've got HIPAA in the healthcare industry. There are other regulated industries, but there are some that aren't as regulated. So how do you look at that landscape?
So basically, people are very careful about PII or personally identifying information, as well as information that is called sensitive attributes, ethnicity, or weight, or whatever it is. So those things people are good at protecting. Where things will get tricky, and which is why Peter's point is that we need to get AI to get smart enough to guard those things. So in this conversation, the fact that I'm trying to act sober and somber by my shirt and indicating certain things, that may be a sensitive attribute and may not be a sensitive attribute, depending on what use you're going to make of it. So we have these technologies, like Peter referred to in the Fabric, called feature stores, which are, there's a feature called sentiment, the feature called tone, a feature called, what am I allowed to learn? So you not just guard data, but you also guard what inference somebody is trying to get out of data. So you can get very, very granular.
Yeah.
So if anything, I think the notion of privacy, the very basics are really being very well handled. And of course, it's in some sense, the very basics are no different than they are for any other cloud service on Microsoft's Azure cloud. And it's something that we're very proud of.
So here, this is going to be more like a research sort of topic, but okay. So until now, when you had a data scientist, they were told, enterprise data scientists, here's my data. I need a model that actually predicts readmission rate or predicts fault in equipment and so on. In other words, people created applications out of data science. So they were told what the task was, and they did everything that was necessary. We never had the reverse, which is, I've got all this data, I wonder what I can do with it. Now here, and as Peter said, the space just explodes. So the traditional way of taking data and then sort of looking at the features, reducing it, and then sort of seeing whether it does a particular task, that becomes impossible when the number of tasks you could have could be hundreds, if not infinity. So now, the research happening, and I'm involved in some of that, but many other people are, is how do you define the data as state at a level where you really can quickly test it against lots of possibilities. So basically, we're now in this world where what we can do with data is expanding. What is data is expanding. People never thought of the digital exhaust, their machine log as valuable data. Or the phone recording of a customer. So what's data is expanding? Which modalities come? Is the air quality important for the route you take somebody through a forest fire? There's been a lot of news about that. So basically, we are now in a place where if data is the new oil, we need to really figure out. So yes, in the previous session, Peter gave a wonderful example of a copper wire being invented. And now the question is, what can I do with this copper? Maybe if I could coat it, I can do the following. If I can elongate it, I can do the following. So we need that exploratory part of AI that hasn't yet fully developed. There are techniques are there, but they've not been systematized.
Right.
I just think of this as, to use another analogy, is it's important more than ever to skate where the puck is going.
Oh, Wayne Gretzky analogies.
And what is happening is that the value of data not only will be easier to realize with the advancing improvements in AI, but there's the potential for dramatic amplification effects as not only your enterprise alone, but your stakeholders, your industry, and your other partners, maybe even your competitors, start to be able to together, in the same way that everyone on the internet started to be able to benefit from network effects, that there may be similar kinds of amplification effects with data in the near future.
I mean, yesterday, Peter explained why researchers are talking about business transformation, because certain kinds of business transformations, like a new product, do take 2 or 3 years, could take longer. And of course, you need benefits all the way along. So you're bridging from today's technology to what can be. Here also, as Peter's pointing out, certain data may be cheap to acquire right now. Are you going when it becomes more valuable? Are you going into business areas that your data will support? So basically, thinking about today, getting value today, but also keeping the explorer's mind, the growth mindset in there, I think is really interesting.
Is there a way that I can know where the puck is going, though? I mean, Wayne Gretzky always magically ended up where it was and either managed to make an assist or a goal. But that, I think, is a big question for me as a business leader is, what if I skate in the wrong direction and then I spend a lot of money and miss it?
Yeah, I'm afraid to say that the answers tend to be very abstract, but the best one that I'm aware of is from our CTO, Kevin Scott, which is to try to think in your line of business or adjacencies, the things that are impossible today, but might become merely difficult tomorrow because of AI.
So we've been talking at a CEO level, a CXO level, but let's say I'm an employee at one of those companies, and I'm a little concerned that they're collecting data that I don't necessarily want them to collect, or do I have to give permissions? How are you addressing the privacy down a level, not just from data privacy, but from my own personal privacy in this realm of data collection, data synthesis?
Yeah, this is something that's incredibly important, and actually, I think the good thing is that legal scholars, privacy experts and advocates, regulators around the world are thinking hard about these things, and in fact, there is now a rapidly evolving landscape of both legal tests as well as new regulations that are being developed to do things such as protect employee and other customer privacy, The EU, in some ways, has been really out in front, and we've been doing everything we can to help support and inform these to the extent that's possible. Also, we have found it necessary within Microsoft for any enterprise that wants to develop new technologies using AI to go through a vetting process to try to understand what the intentions are and to help create the relationship and the ongoing discussion for the appropriate use of AI. And that has been captured in the responsible AI principles. And we've detailed numerous case studies in our first transparency report on AI that we issued just 2 months ago. It's something that we're very proud of, but we look at that report as only the start. It's something that we think we can keep doing better and better over time.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how do I keep myself from being surveilled and being used as data?
So one is really, as Peter described, the safeguards and the transparency around data. We also, what LLMs have done is reduce the need to obtain data by invading somebody's privacy. There's so much data that's already, so much knowledge that's already in there, and we can now generate, okay, show me somebody who's having a particular kind of conversation, or generate me somebody who's moving in the plant in a particular way. We don't have to surveil. We do not have to get specific to a person. So that's one of the beautiful things that we are seeing with LLMs. So this, we might call this, you can operate in a low data environment. You can operate really effectively.
In fact, there is emerging research here at Microsoft Research, but also at several top universities around the world in being able to generate synthetic data sets in a differentially private manner, in a way that guarantees specific privacy kind of aspects. And that is something that also has tremendous business potential because the models then that are trained on those are less encumbered.
So to get geeky, is that using homomorphic encryption type things, or is that the differential privacy is something that I don't really understand how you do that?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because this relates to what we were saying about encryption.
Right.
You know, and there's now a question about the extent to which encryption is needed in a future where you might have an extremely intelligent AI.
Interesting.
And so if you can trust an AI to reliably keep secrets, then there would be the belief that there would be a tremendous number of applications where encryption is currently used where it wouldn't be in the future.
That very statement is just funny, that you could trust an AI to keep secrets.
It's a question whether we'll ever get there, but in fact, such an AI system would allow tremendous flexibility.
Well, then maybe AIs would be better at keeping secrets than people. Who knows?
They can certainly be told what the ethics and rules are and the policies are. Sure. And of course, as Peter sort of points out, with differential privacy, you don't have to represent any particular person. You can create imaginary people. Basically, you can add so much noise in the system that even if the secret were to be broken, no particular person's privacy can get invaded.
Gotcha.